Dust rose where the creek should have been running, and 40 men stood along the dry planks of the Rocky Bar sluice with their shovels hanging useless in their hands. A stranger in a black coat had nailed the head gate shut before sunrise and posted beside it a folded paper claiming the whole of the water for a company none of them had ever laid eyes on. Yunru Tan read the paper twice before anyone else in camp had worked out what it actually said. 6 months earlier, she had signed her name against a debt she had not chosen, traded from a broker's ledger in San Francisco to a camp store 2 days beyond the last rail spur, told she would scrub linens and cook rice until the passage money was paid in full. Nobody at Rocky Bar had asked what she knew about water, only what she owed, and a debt she had learned quickly, bought a person no patience and no name of her own. Foreman Ezra Colton had watched her ring a washboard with the same steady hands other men used to set dynamite, and he was the only man at Rocky Bar who had ever asked what to call her, instead of simply calling her the laundress. Wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk, she still carried her grandfather's water stick, notched wood worn smooth from 40 years of measuring another country's rain. Now the man in the black coat meant to starve out an entire camp on the strength of a filed piece of paper, and Yunru Tan, kneeling at the dry mouth of the sluice with her grandfather's gauge already in her hand, understood something the recorder's office in town had not yet worked out. Paper could lie about a creek, the land underneath it never did. 3 years before the water at Rocky Bar ever stopped running, Yunru Tan had spent her mornings ankle-deep in the fish ponds below her family's mulberry dikes outside Shunda, reading the level of the water the way other children read a book, because a wrong reading meant a drowned crop of silkworm leaves in spring or a starved pond of carp by autumn. Her grandfather had built those dikes with his own hands 2 decades before her birth, cutting sluice gates into the earthen walls at exact intervals so that water could be walked from pond to pond on command, rising here, falling there, never once left to find its own careless way through a season's harvest. He taught her to read a gauge before he taught her to read characters. A notch length of bamboo he called simply the water stick. And by the time she was 12, she could tell, from the space between 2 notches, whether a pond needed opening or closing before her father had even finished his morning tea. It was a skill the marriage brokers who came through Shunde after the floods of 1871 had no use for whatsoever, and when her father's silk trade collapsed under 2 ruined harvests running. The debt that swallowed the family took the shape of a contract Yunru signed herself, in her own hand, because her father's hands had stopped being steady enough to hold a brush. The broker in Canton had promised a household position in San Francisco, decent wages, and a fair number of years to work off the passage. What the contract actually specified, printed small beneath the promises, was that the debt holder could sell the paper onward to any buyer willing to cover the balance, and a woman crossing an ocean alone with no family name to vouch for her was, in the broker's own dry phrase, easily resold. She crossed the Pacific believing she was bound for a merchant's kitchen, and instead found her contract sold twice more before she had even left the San Francisco docks, the balance climbing each time with a resale fee she had never agreed to and could not read closely enough in her early stumbling English to dispute. The final buyer was a camp store 2 days past the end of the Central Pacific Rail Spur, run by a widow named Maeve Dugan, who did not believe in cruelty, but did believe firmly in a ledger, and who informed Yunru on her first night at Rocky Bar, not unkindly, that she now owed $140 in passage debt to a woman she had never met, payable in laundry, cooking, and whatever mending the camp required, for as long as it took to settle. Rocky Bar in the spring of 1876 was 400 men, 1 store, 1 assay office, and a creek the miners called Solitude. For reasons nobody troubled to explain to a new arrival, its water diverted along a mile of hand-dug ditch into the wooden sluice that fed the camp's placer claims. And, not incidentally, every kettle, wash tub, and garden row the camp depended on to survive a dry Sierra summer. Widow Duggan introduced her to the camp, not by name but by function, calling out across a store full of miners that the new laundress had arrived and would take in, washing Tuesdays and Fridays. And Yunru understood within her first hour that, whatever she had been in Shunda, a girl trusted with her family's water and her father's ledgers both, she was in Rocky Bar simply a debt with a washboard attached to it. The one voice in the store that first evening addressed her differently belonged to an old man doing the store's accounts by lamplight, a fellow immigrant named Dung, who had worked the railroad grade a decade earlier and stayed on afterward tending a small vegetable plot at the camp's edge, and who greeted her first in halting Toishanese, and then, seeing her surprise, switched without ceremony into the clipped camp English that had kept him alive and solvent for 10 years among men who mostly wished he would go home. Old Dung warned her, that first night, exactly how the camp worked. Keep your eyes down around the assay office. Never argue with a man holding a filed paper, no matter how wrong the paper reads. And above all, never let anyone at Rocky Bar learn. You can add a column of figures faster than they can, because a woman who corrects a man's arithmetic in this camp does not get thanked for it. She nodded and said nothing of her grandfather's gauge, still wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk, nor of the fact that she had already, without quite meaning to, begun counting the drop of the ditch behind the store on her walk in from the wagon road, an old habit from the Dikes that made her hands restless whenever she stood near moving water. Across the yard, a lean man in a canvas coat stood arguing quietly with two other miners over a survey stake driven into the mud at an angle that plainly troubled him. And though Yunru did not yet know his name was Ezra Colton, or that he ran the ditch crew whose sluice fed half the camp, she noticed, the way she noticed water, that he was the only man in the yard actually looking at the ground instead of at her. Within a week of her arrival, 3 separate miners had approached Widow Dugan's counter to ask what it would cost to buy out the remainder of Yunru's contract, speaking across the room as though she were a bolt of cloth on display, rather than a woman standing directly behind the counter, folding shirts. And each time Dugan quoted the balance still owed as flatly as she quoted flour by the pound. One man, a placer miner named Otto Fenn, mispronounced her family name 3 different ways in a single sentence before giving up, and simply calling her Susie, a name he assured her, laughing, was easier on everyone. And when she corrected him quietly, giving her name its proper sound a second time, he only repeated his own version louder, as though volume might settle what pronunciation could not. The camp's young assay clerk, a sharp-tongued fellow named Purdy Slade, was hardly better. He addressed all his instructions about starch and mending fees to Widow Dugan, even while standing directly across the counter from Yunru, using her only in the third person, tell her Tuesday, not Wednesday, as though the woman herself lacked the ears God had given her. And Dugan, tired and not unkind but well past the age of fighting other people's small battles, generally just repeated the instruction rather than correct the habit. Yunru had grown up believing her competence with numbers and water would eventually be seen by someone, the way her father had seen it, the way her grandfather had built an entire dike system, trusting her small hands to help maintain it. At Rocky Bar, she was coming to understand that competence unaccompanied by a recognized name and a white face bought a person exactly nothing. She kept the water stick hidden all the same. Folded beneath a false bottom, Dugan did not know her trunk possessed because Old Deng's warning had settled into her the way cold settles into wet cloth, and because she had already watched what the camp did to a man who corrected its arithmetic in public. A Cornish surveyor, 2 seasons back, Old Deng told her over supper, had questioned a company's stake placement once too loudly and found himself unemployed within the month. His own figures never once examined, only his manner. It was Cyrus Wexford who first walked through Rocky Bar's yard that spring, wearing the particular confidence of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. A slight, precise agent for the Union Ditch Company, dressed a full grade better than any miner in camp. Carrying a leather portfolio, he consulted the way other men consulted a pistol. He came, that first visit, only to inspect the company's flume rights 2 ridges over, and he did not so much as glance at Yunru as she carried a basket of wrung linens past him in the yard, though he did pause briefly to ask Ezra Colton, in a tone of mild professional interest, whether Rocky Bar's own water filing had ever actually been surveyed properly or simply copied, as so many small claims were, from whatever the nearest company happened to be using. Colton told him plainly that the ditch crew had walked and measured every foot of it themselves in 1868, filed clean, and had drawn from Solitude Creek without contest for 8 years running, and Wexford had smiled at that, folded his portfolio shut, and said only that 8 years without contest was not quite the same thing as 8 years without a mistake waiting to be found in the county book. Yunru, setting the linen basket down within earshot, understood almost nothing of the exchange in her first months of Camp English beyond the tone of it. the particular unhurried menace of a man who enjoyed being underestimated, and it would be some weeks yet before she learned that a company man's visit to inspect an unrelated flume rarely stayed unrelated for long. That evening she asked Old Dung, in her careful mix of toy Chinese and camp English, who the well-dressed stranger had been, and Old Dung, setting down his abacus with unusual care, told her that men like Wexford did not carry guns because they did not need them, that a filed paper in a county recorder's book could take a man's water, his claim, and his whole season's labor more efficiently than any six-gun ever managed, and that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to hope Rocky Bar's paper had been filed clean and simply never think about it again. The leak began small, a dark patch spreading along the ditch bank behind the camp store that most men walked past without a second look, and it was Yunru who noticed it first, not because she was looking for trouble, but because 6 years of walking dike walls had trained her eye to catch exactly that kind of wrongness without her even deciding to look. She noticed too that the water pooling below the store's washing trough had begun arriving slower each morning and murkier each evening, a silt-heavy crawl instead of the clean, steady flow she had grown used to since arriving. And where another laundress might have simply worked around it, Yunru found herself, almost against her own better judgment, walking the ditch bank at dusk with her sleeves still wet, counting the distance between the leak and the main headgate under her breath in Cantonese numbers. Nobody in camp would have understood even if they had heard her. She told Old Dung what she had found, expecting him to repeat his usual caution. And instead, he surprised her by walking the bank himself the following morning, examining the soft patch of earth with the particular squint of a man who had once helped survey a railroad grade, and pronouncing it, grudgingly, exactly the kind of slow washout that could open into a full breach within a fortnight if nobody addressed it. It was Old Dung, not Yunru, who finally carried the warning to Ezra Colton, because Old Dung understood something Yunru had not yet fully learned about Rocky Bar. That information traveled differently, depending on whose mouth it left, and a warning from an old immigrant gardener stood a chance of being heard, where the same warning from a young Chinese laundress would likely be dismissed before the sentence finished. Colton walked out to the ditch within the hour, knelt at the soft patch Dung pointed out, and confirmed the washout with a low curse before asking, almost as an afterthought, who had actually spotted it first, since Dung himself had admitted he'd only been shown the place. When Dung told him plainly that the laundress had found it 3 days before he had, Colton looked up from the ditch bank toward the store, found Yunru standing at a distance in the yard, pretending to sort linens, and did something no man at Rocky Bar had troubled to do in the 6 weeks since her arrival. He crossed the yard, removed his hat, and asked her, in plain, unhurried words, what she wished to be called, since laundress plainly was not her name, and he intended to stop using it. She told him her name the way her mother had taught her to say it to strangers who mattered, slowly, each syllable given its own weight, and Ezra Colton repeated it back to her twice, getting it wrong the first time and correcting himself without embarrassment. The second, which was, she realized, standing there in the fading light with an empty laundry basket at her hip, the first time in 6 weeks that any man at Rocky Bar had bothered to get her name right on purpose rather than by accident. He did not ask about the washout again, not directly, though 2 days later, the crew reinforced the exact stretch of bank she had flagged, and when she mentioned, carefully and in her still imperfect English, that the water arriving at the store trough seemed to run cleaner again since the repair, Colton simply nodded, as though a laundress noticing the clarity of ditch water were the most ordinary observation in the world, rather than the small, dangerous crack in Rocky Bar's usual silence that it actually was. Old Dung warned her again that same week, more gently this time, that being seen by the foreman was not the same as being safe in camp, that Wexford's visit had left an uneasy feeling in him he could not quite name, and that a woman who had already caught one man's attention for the right reasons risked catching another's for the wrong ones. Yunru understood the warning and carried it with her the way she carried the water stick, unspoken but never far from reach, and told Old Deng only that she intended to keep watching the ditch whether anyone thanked her for it or not, because watching water had never once in her whole life brought her anything but the truth of a situation before anyone else in the room had troubled to look. That night, unpacking mending by candlelight, she allowed herself, for the first time since Canton, to wonder whether a place built entirely on other men's paper might still somehow have room in it for a woman who could read the land the paper claimed to describe, though she said the thought aloud to no one. Not even to Agung's memory, folded as carefully into silence as the water stick was folded into oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk. Her grandfather had never once called himself an engineer, only a man who had spent 40 years arguing with water until it agreed to behave, and it was on the dikes outside Shunda, kneeling beside him in mud that smelled of carp and cut mulberry, that Yunru had first learned the principle that would later save an entire mining camp. She could not, at 8 years old, have imagined existing. That water always obeyed the same laws, whether it moved through a bamboo sluice gate in Guangdong or a hand-dug ditch in the Sierra Nevada, and that the laws could be read, precisely if a person knew how to measure the fall. A pond that dropped too steeply flooded its neighbor downhill within a season. A pond that dropped too gently silted shut and starved the fish before autumn. The entire Mulberry Dike system, dozens of ponds linked across 3 families' land, survived only because someone, generation after generation, walked the walls with a notched gauge and kept the fall between each gate within a narrow, exacting range that her grandfather had once described to her as the difference between a harvest and a drowning. He had shown her, the summer she turned 10, how the county water register back home recorded each family's rights not merely by the pond's size, but by its measured drop, a number written into a book that determined, with the finality of law, whose water flowed first in a dry season and whose family went without. And he had told her, half in warning and half in pride, that a man who understood the number in that book truly understood it, held more power over his neighbors than any magistrate's seal could grant him. She had not thought of that lesson in months, buried under the daily arithmetic of debt and washboards and camp English, until the evening Ezra Colton mentioned, almost in passing while thanking Old Dung again for the washout warning, that the entire dispute simmering under Wexford's recent visit concerned exactly such a number, the recorded fall of Solitude Creek's original 1868 survey, filed in a county book 2 days' ride from camp. A figure Colton himself admitted he had never personally remeasured because the ditch had run without contest for 8 years, and no one saw reason to doubt paper that old. Yunru said nothing that evening, only listened, but she lay awake long after the camp had gone quiet, turning her grandfather's old lesson over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by handling. Paper could say whatever a man wished it to say. The land beneath it, measured honestly, could not. She began, without quite announcing it to anyone, to walk the length of Rocky Bar's ditch every evening after the day's washing was done, ostensibly gathering the last of the drying linens from the racks near the sluice, actually counting paces and watching the water's behavior at every bend and narrowing with the same close attention she had once given her family's dike walls. What she found troubled her more the longer she looked. The ditch ran, by her count, with a fall that felt subtly wrong in its lower third, gentler than the upper stretch by a margin small enough that no minor shoveling gravel would ever have noticed it, but exactly the kind of discrepancy her grandfather had taught her to distrust in any watercourse claiming a single, consistent survey. A ditch dug and measured honestly in one continuous effort, she knew from a childhood spent correcting exactly such errors, kept its fall reasonably even along its length, unless the land itself demanded otherwise. And the land along Rocky Bar's lower ditch, so far as she could see walking it at dusk, gave no obvious reason for the water to slow the way it did. She did not yet understand enough of American law or American paper to know what the discrepancy might mean, only that it reminded her, uncomfortably, of a dispute her own family had once weathered when a neighboring dike owner tried to claim an extra pond by quietly altering a single gate's height over 2 dry seasons, hoping no one troubled to remeasure before the county recorder made his rounds. She mentioned the odd fall to Old Dung first, tentatively, expecting him to caution silence again, and instead found him unusually quiet himself, turning the observation over with the same grudging care he had given the washout weeks before, until he finally admitted that he had heard rumors, traded low over cards, that Wexford's Union Ditch Company had once, years back before Colton's crew arrived, run a survey crew through this exact stretch of the Sierra under a different name entirely, filing claims across 2 or 3 forks of the same watershed, under names close enough to confuse any recorder working quickly. Neither of them said Wexford's name aloud that night, as though naming him too plainly might summon exactly the trouble old Dung had spent 10 years teaching himself to avoid. But Yunru went to sleep that evening, for the first time since Canton, with something other than dread sitting in her chest. The quiet, unfamiliar weight of a suspicion she intended, however carefully, to follow through to its number. Cyrus Wexford returned to Rocky Bar on a cold morning in late April with 2 hired men, a company surveyor's chain, and a filed order from the county recorder's office that he read aloud in the camp yard with the flat, unhurried satisfaction of a man who had been waiting some time for the pleasure of it, informing the assembled miners that Union Ditch Company held the senior recorded right to the entirety of what his order called the Widow Fork of Solitude Creek, filed in the county book in 1868, 8 full years before Rocky Bar's own claim, and that effective immediately the camp's headgate would be closed, pending a full accounting of whatever water Rocky Bar had drawn without proper right in the years since. Ezra Colton argued that Rocky Bar's own filing, made the same year, covered the very same creek under the very same name. And Wexford, producing his leather portfolio with the theatrical calm of a man who had rehearsed the moment, showed him a county survey map indicating that the historic Union Ditch filing, in fact, described a different watercourse entirely. A smaller fork, 2 ridges to the north, that local usage had since blurred together with Solitude Creek through decades of loose talk and looser maps. An honest confusion, Wexford said, that the recorder's office was simply now, belatedly correcting in the company's favor. By noon, the headgate stood nailed shut, the ditch behind the camp store already beginning its slow crawl toward stillness. And by evening, the full weight of the closure had settled over Rocky Bar, with the particular dread of men who understood, without needing it, explained twice, that no water meant no sluicing, no washing, no cooking beyond what the store's rain barrels held, and no season's wages worth speaking of once the placer claims dried up entirely. Yunru stood at the edge of the yard that evening, watching the last thin trickle die out of the ditch behind the wash trough. The very stretch of water she had walked and counted and worried over for weeks, and felt something harden in her that had nothing to do with fear. A cold, familiar clarity she remembered from the flooded rice terraces above Shunde, the year everything else had already been lost, that a person could either watch the water disappear or go and find out with her own 2 hands exactly where the number in the recorder's book had gone wrong. That night, old Deng found her at the kitchen table with a borrowed slate, her grandfather's water stick unwrapped and lying openly beside her for the first time since her arrival, converting the dike measurements of her childhood into whatever units the American ditch used. And when he asked her, quietly, what she thought she was doing, she answered him in words he would repeat to Colton the following morning, almost exactly as she had spoken them. She meant to walk both forks of that creek herself and measure in feet per 100, which one Wexford's old survey had actually described. Colton did not laugh at her, which surprised her more than she expected, though he did sit across the kitchen table for a long, silent moment, turning the water stick over in his hands, running his thumb along notches he could not read, before asking her, plainly, whether she actually believed a set of measurements taken with a length of foreign bamboo could carry any weight at all against a filed county survey backed by a company lawyer. She told him, through old Dung's careful translation of the parts her English still could not quite reach, that the gauge itself mattered less than the method behind it, that a watercourse's fall, measured honestly in feet, dropped per 100 feet traveled, was a fact of the land no lawyer's portfolio could argue away, and that if Wexford's original 1868 survey had in fact been taken on the smaller northern fork exactly as he now claimed, its recorded fall would be measurably different from the fall of the actual creek feeding Rocky Bar's sluice, a difference she was confident she could find and prove within a matter of days if someone withstanding in the camp was willing to walk both watercourses beside her and witness the numbers honestly. Colton sat with that for longer than she expected, long enough that old Dung shifted uneasily in his chair, and when he finally spoke, it was not agreement exactly, but something adjacent to it. A foreman's blunt practicality finding its way slowly toward a woman's stubborn certainty. He told her that Rocky Bar had exactly 1 dry season's worth of patience left before 400 men started looking for someone to blame, that he had nothing left to lose by walking 2 creeks with a laundress and an old gardener, and that if her numbers turned out wrong, he would at least have tried something before the company's lawyers finished the job of ruining them all on paper alone. He did not say what would happen if her numbers turned out right, and Yunru, watching his face in the lamplight, understood that he had not yet let himself imagine it. Not because he doubted her, she realized slowly, but because a man in his position had learned the hard way not to hope for outcomes he could not yet control, a caution she recognized immediately, having carried the very same one across an entire ocean herself. They set out before dawn 3 days later, Colton, Old Dang, and Yunru following the northern fork first, the smaller, colder watercourse that ran 2 ridges over through country none of Rocky Bar's ditch crew had ever bothered to survey, since it fed no claim any of them worked and carried, by the look of its narrow, rocky bed, barely a third of Solitude Creek's honest flow. Yunru worked the water stick the way her grandfather had taught her at 10 years old, driving it into the stream bed at measured intervals and reading the drop between each mark against a length of knotted cord Colton had brought for exactly this purpose, calling the figures aloud in careful English numbers while Old Dang recorded them on a borrowed slate. And by midday, the pattern emerging along that northern fork was unmistakable even to Colton's untrained eye. A steep, tumbling fall, far steeper than anything Union Ditch's flume 2 ridges over could actually make productive use of. A creek whose numbers matched, almost exactly, the figures written into Wexford's 1868 survey filing that Colton had finally ridden to the county seat to copy from the recorder's book himself the week before. They walked Solitude Creek's own fork the following day, the actual watercourse feeding Rocky Bar's sluice, and here the numbers told an entirely different story, a gentler, steadier fall consistent with a much larger creek, one that bore no honest resemblance whatsoever to the steep northern figures Wexford's company had filed 8 years earlier under a name close enough to Solitude to blur, over time and careless talk, into the very creek Rocky Bar had drawn from, without contest, for nearly as long. Yunru sat on a granite outcrop above the confluence where both forks finally met, her grandfather's water stick still damp in her hands, and explained to Colton, slowly and precisely, exactly what the discrepancy meant in the plain language of a family that had settled water disputes on paper for 3 generations. That Wexford's company held a legitimate senior claim to a real creek, the steep northern fork nobody at Rocky Bar had ever wanted, and no legitimate claim at all to the gentler creek his order had actually closed the headgate on. A mismatch either honestly made in a hurried survey decades ago, or, as she suspected from the convenient timing of Wexford's sudden visit, quietly discovered and deliberately exploited the moment someone in the company noticed how easily 2 similar names in one county book could be made to serve a different creek entirely. Colton wanted to ride straight for the county seat with the figures that same evening, but Old Dung, who had spent 10 years learning exactly how little a foreman's word carried against a company lawyer's, counseled patience instead, arguing that raw numbers scrawled on a borrowed slate by a laundress, an old gardener, and one working foreman would convince nobody in a recorder's office accustomed to Wexford's expensive portfolio and practiced calm, and that they needed the figures written up properly, witnessed and ideally confirmed by someone in the county with no stake in Rocky Bar's fortunes at all. It was Widow Dugan, unexpectedly, who solved that particular problem, revealing over supper that she had corresponded for years with a retired railroad surveyor, now keeping books at a hardware concern in Chalk Landing, a Welshman named Griffith Pell, who owed her a favor twice over from a winter she'd carried his family's credit through a lean season without ever once mentioning it since, and who could, she was fairly certain, be persuaded to walk both forks a second time himself, and confirm or dispute Yunru's numbers with the kind of neutral authority a recorder's office might actually respect. Yunru spent the 2 days waiting for word from Chalk Landing, writing out her measurements a second time in her most careful English hand, converting every figure from the notched increments her grandfather had used into the feet and inches the county book required, checking each calculation twice against the borrowed slate the way she had once checked her father's ledgers, before a bad harvest made careful checking meaningless anyway. She found herself, during those 2 waiting days, telling Colton more about Shunda than she had told anyone since crossing the Pacific, the mulberry dikes, her grandfather's 40 years of arguing with water, the particular grief of watching a flood arise in one spring, what 3 generations had built gate by careful gate. And Colton listened the way she had noticed he listened to everything that mattered to him, without interrupting, without hurrying her toward the point, until she finished a sentence in Cantonese without meaning to, and caught herself, embarrassed, only to have him ask, quietly, what the word had meant, rather than let it pass, unremarked the way every other man at Rocky Bar would have. Griffith Pell arrived at Rocky Bar 6 days after Duggan's letter reached Chalk Landing, a stooped, methodical man who introduced himself to Yunru with a formal handshake that startled her more than any camp courtesy had managed in the whole of her time in America, and who spent his first afternoon not questioning her figures, but quietly repeating her measurements himself along both forks, driving his own surveyor's rod into the same points she had marked, and comparing every reading against her slate with an expression that gave nothing away until the work was entirely finished. When he finally spoke, at supper that evening, he addressed the whole table rather than Colton alone, a courtesy Yunru noted and would remember long afterward, stating plainly that her figures matched his own to within an inch at every point along both creeks, that the mismatch between Wexford's filed 1868 survey and the actual course of Solitude Creek was, in his professional judgment, too large and too convenient to read as honest confusion, and that he intended to say so, in exactly those words, before the county recorder himself. The hearing was set for the following week in Chalk Landing's small courthouse, and word of it traveled through Rocky Bar faster than any of them had wanted, arriving at Wexford's ears well before the appointed morning, and prompting him to visit the camp store one final time, alone, to inform Yunru directly, in the mild, unhurried voice she now recognized as his particular kind of threat, that a recorder's hearing was no place for a laundress's opinion, regardless of whose figures she claimed to have taken, and that camps which caused the Union Ditch Company unnecessary trouble had a way of finding their remaining claims scrutinized rather more closely than they might prefer. Yunru answered him, for the first time since his arrival at Rocky Bar, directly and in her own steadily improving English, rather than through Old Deng's translation, telling him that she had spent her childhood reading water her grandfather trusted with 3 families' harvests, that the figures she carried had already been confirmed by a surveyor of the county's own choosing, and that she intended to be present at the hearing, whether Mr. Wexford found that arrangement convenient or not. Word of the coming hearing spread through Rocky Bar within a single day, and the camp's reaction split Yunru's small circle of allies from the larger body of miners more sharply than anything that had happened since her arrival, with Otto Fenn loudly predicting to anyone who would listen that no county recorder in California was about to overturn 8 years of filed record on the word of a washerwoman waving a stick from the old country, and Purdy Slade openly siding with Wexford's account of an honest survey error, since a smooth resolution in the company's favor meant, conveniently, that his own small stake in a claim adjoining Union Ditch's holdings would suffer no disruption whatsoever. Colton found himself, in the days before the hearing, defending a decision he had barely made peace with himself, fielding questions from his own ditch crew about why he was staking the camp's water rights on the measurements of a woman most of them had spoken to perhaps twice, and answering each time with the same blunt line that surprised even him a little with how completely he had come to believe it, that he trusted a set of numbers checked twice by a stranger with no reason to lie over a filed paper written by a company with every reason to. Widow Dugan, for her part, quietly informed Yunru that her outstanding debt would be considered fully suspended, not forgiven, but paused, until the matter of the hearing settled one way or the other. A small kindness that Yunru understood, without needing it explained, was Dugan's own careful way of choosing a side without saying so aloud in a camp store full of Wexford's potential allies. Only Old Deng seemed entirely unsurprised by the camp's divided reaction, telling Yunru quietly on the eve of the hearing that he had watched exactly this pattern play out in a dozen camps over 10 years, that a community facing an outsider's threat would always split first along whichever fault line was already weakest, and that the coming days would tell her, more clearly than any survey ever could, precisely which of Rocky Bar's 400 men actually meant what they'd said about her these past weeks, and which had simply been waiting to see how the wind blew before committing themselves. The morning of the hearing brought a hard, driving rain down out of the Sierra that turned Chalk Landing's single street to churned mud before the courthouse doors even opened, a storm Old Deng noted quietly to Yunru, was the season's first real snowmelt rain, the kind that would swell both forks of Solitude Creek within days, regardless of whatever the recorder decided, as though the mountain itself intended to render its own verdict on the matter before any man's book could. Wexford arrived with his own attorney and a second surveyor hired specifically to challenge Pell's findings. A confident, well-dressed presence in a courtroom built for perhaps 30 townspeople that had somehow filled with nearly twice that number, half of Rocky Bar having ridden or walked the 12 miles through the storm rather than miss the outcome, and Yunru seated between Colton and Old Dung at a plain wooden table with her grandfather's water stick laid openly before her for the first time in front of strangers, felt the particular weight of every eye in the room settling on her as the recorder called the hearing to order. Wexford's hired surveyor spoke first and at length, arguing with practiced fluency that the Northern Fork's steep terrain made it commercially useless for any purpose beyond what Union Ditch already claimed, and that the company's true intent, whatever the original survey's precise wording, had always plainly been Solitude Creek itself. A generous reading of 8-year-old paper that drew murmurs of agreement from more of the gathered townspeople than Yunru had hoped for. When her own turn came, her hands did not shake, though she had expected them to, and she spoke slowly in the careful English she had spent 2 waiting days rehearsing, walking the recorder through her measurements point by point, feet dropped per 100 feet traveled. The water stick's notches translated into the county's own units. Each figure matched precisely against Pell's independent confirmation, and she watched, as she spoke, the courtroom's restless murmuring slowly give way to something quieter, more attentive, the particular silence of people who had come expecting a spectacle and were instead, gradually, hearing an argument they could not easily dismiss no matter how much some of them wished to. It was Wexford's own attorney, pressing her afterward on where precisely a laundress had learned to take such measurements at all, who gave Colton the opening he had apparently been waiting for the entire session. And when the room turned toward him, he rose slowly, faced the gathered crowd of his own camp rather than the recorder, and said, in a voice that carried to the back wall without needing to be raised, that Rocky Bar's foreman had walked both creeks himself beside her and would stake his own name, his own crew's water, and his own standing in this camp on the plain fact that her numbers were true, whatever anyone in this room preferred to believe about who was allowed to know such things. The recorder, an unhurried man named Absalom Feeney, who had clearly seen enough county water disputes to distrust confident speeches from either side equally, called for a recess rather than a verdict, informing the crowded room that he intended to review both survey filings against Pell's confirmed measurements personally before ruling on a matter this consequential. And the storm outside showed no sign of easing as Rocky Bar's contingent filed out into the mud to wait through what would become the longest afternoon of Yunru's time in America. Wexford found her alone near the courthouse steps during that recess. The crowd thinned enough that his mild voice carried without effort, and told her, without any of his earlier courtesy, that whatever Feeney ultimately decided, she should understand that a woman who had just publicly humiliated a company the size of Union Ditch in front of half a mining county would find her welcome in California considerably shorter than she currently imagined, that debts had a way of being called in early for troublesome debtors, and that he wished her to know precisely whose displeasure she had earned before the ruling came down, either way. Yunru answered him this time without translating a single word into caution first, telling him plainly that she had crossed an ocean already owing more than any man in that courthouse could threaten to add to the sum, that she had buried a debt collector's letter once before, under a flood that took everything else her family owned and survived it anyway, and that a company man's mild voice, however carefully practiced, had stopped frightening her somewhere between the Northern Fork's steep rocks and the recorder's own patient questions. It was Old Dung who found her shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of having said it, moments after Wexford walked away, and who told her, gripping her shoulder with unusual firmness for a man normally so careful about touch, that in 10 years at Rocky Bar, he had never once seen anyone speak to a company man in quite that tone, and lived to tell Widow Duggan about it over supper, and that whatever Feeney decided in the hours ahead, she had already, in his own considered judgment, won something that afternoon no ruling could take back from her. Feeney returned to the bench 3 hours later, with the storm still hammering the courthouse roof, and the room, if anything, more crowded than before, and read his ruling in the same unhurried voice he had used to call the recess, stating for the county record that Griffith Pell's independent survey confirmed the measurements presented by Yunru Tan to within margins. Feeney himself described as remarkably precise for instruments as modest as a notched wooden gauge. That Union Ditch Company's 1868 filing did in fact describe, by every figure available to the county, the steep northern fork rather than Solitude Creek proper, and that the company's senior water right therefore applied to a watercourse it had never once drawn from and held no valid claim whatsoever to the creek-feeding Rocky Bar's sluice. A cheer went up from the Rocky Bar side of the room, loud enough to rattle the courthouse windows, and Yunru sat very still through the noise of it, watching Wexford's careful composure crack for the first time since she had met him, his attorney already gathering papers with the brisk unhappiness of a man calculating how much this afternoon had just cost his client, while Feeney added, almost as an afterthought delivered directly toward Wexford's table, that he would be forwarding the full record of Union Ditch's convenient confusion between two similarly named forks to the State Land Office for its own review, a sentence that Old Dung translated for her twice, delighted, before she quite believed she had heard it correctly the first time. Colton reached the head gate before any of them, riding ahead through the last of the storm to pull the company's nails from the wood himself, and by the time Yunru arrived back at Rocky Bar near midnight, soaked through and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the rain, water was already crawling back along the dry ditch bed toward the camp store in the dark, a sound she had not heard in 9 days and had genuinely feared. Somewhere in the storm's longest hour, she might never hear again. She knelt at the ditch's edge in the mud and the dark, and let the returning water run over her fingers exactly as she had once let her family's pond water run over them as a child, and found herself, for the first time since Canton, crying not from grief, but from something closer to relief so complete it had nowhere else in her body left to go. The days that followed the ruling brought a change to Rocky Bar that Yunru had not fully anticipated even in her most hopeful moments, not a sudden warmth from every corner of camp, since Otto Fenn remained sullen and unconvinced for weeks, and Purdy Slade never once offered a direct apology for the months of talking past her at the store counter, but a genuine practical shift in how the camp's daily business treated her presence, beginning with Widow Duggan's quiet decision to cancel the remainder of her passage debt outright, rather than merely pause it, telling Yunru over the store's account book that a woman who had just saved 400 men's water supply had more than settled whatever balance a broker's ledger had once claimed she owed. Colton, for his part, asked Feeney's clerk before leaving Chalk Landing whether a water right dispute of this kind might, in the future, be formally verified by any qualified surveyor, regardless of who held the instrument, and receiving a cautious but genuine yes, returned to camp and told the assembled ditch crew, without asking Yunru's permission first, that Rocky Bar intended to keep her measurements on permanent file alongside the crew's own survey records, a small bureaucratic gesture that meant, in practice, that her name would now appear in the same official book that had once nearly cost the whole camp its water. She began, in the weeks after, walking the ditch openly rather than at dusk in secret, the water stick carried without concealment, and found that miners who had never once addressed her directly now nodded when she passed, not from any sudden warmth of feeling necessarily, but from the plain, grudging respect camps reserved for anyone who had proven, publicly and beyond argument, that they were worth listening to. Word of the Rocky Bar hearing traveled faster through the Sierra camps than Yunru could have predicted, carried by teamsters and traveling peddlers the way all camp news eventually traveled, and within a month a foreman from a smaller claim, 2 valleys south, sent a rider asking, with evident embarrassment at the novelty of the request, whether the laundress who had proven a company's survey wrong might be willing to walk his own disputed ditch for a fair day's wage. By midsummer, Yunru had walked 3 more disputed ditches across 2 neighboring camps, each time with Colton or Old Dung beside her as witness, each time returning to Rocky Bar with a small fee added to savings she had never in her life expected to hold in her own name rather than owed against someone else's ledger, and each time understanding a little more clearly that her grandfather's 40 years of arguing with water had followed her across an entire ocean in a form neither of them could have imagined back among the flooded mulberry dikes of Shunda. She wrote to her mother that summer for the first time since the debt had swallowed the family whole, a letter she rewrote 4 times before she judged it worthy of sending, describing not the camp's hardship, which her mother could likely imagine well enough without details, but the water stick's unexpected second life, measuring a mountain range instead of a scatter of fish ponds, and the particular hard-won pride of watching a county recorder correct his own book, because a woman he had never met refused to let a wrong number stand unchallenged. Ezra Colton asked her, on an evening in late July, when the ditch ran full and clean past the store for the first time in months, without either of them needing to think about it, whether she had ever considered that Rocky Bar might need a formally recognized waterkeeper now that its rights had survived one company's challenge and would very likely face another eventually. A position, he said carefully, that the camp's own men had already begun referring to, half in jest and half not, as hers, before anyone had thought to make it official. She told him she would consider it, though they both understood, standing together at the ditch's edge in the long gold light of a Sierra evening, that the answer had already settled itself weeks earlier, somewhere between a courthouse and chalk landing and a night spent kneeling in returning water with her hands in the current, and that whatever name the camp eventually gave the position, she intended to fill it the way her grandfather had once filled his own quiet authority over 3 families' Dikes. Not loudly, but so thoroughly that no one downstream would ever again think to question whether the water was flowing where it was supposed to. On a clear morning in early autumn, Yunru stood at the confluence above Rocky Bar, where the 2 forks of Solitude Creek finally met, her grandfather's water stick resting now in a carved wooden case Colton had commissioned from the camp's own carpenter, rather than folded away in oilcloth at the bottom of a trunk, and watch both watercourses run exactly as her measurements had once proven they should. The steep northern fork tumbling toward Union Ditch's legitimate claim, the gentler southern water carrying on down through Rocky Bar's sluice to feed a camp that had very nearly starved for lack of it. She thought, standing there, of her grandfather's own dikes still standing outside Shunda under her mother's careful watch, of a flood that had once taken everything her family owned except the one skill no water could wash away, and of the particular, unlikely justice in having crossed an ocean under a debt that priced her at nothing, only to prove, with a length of notched bamboo and a stubborn refusal to look away from a wrongly measured number, that the ground itself had never once agreed with the men who tried to buy and sell her without asking what she knew. If a piece of filed paper had once nearly cost an entire camp its water, and a woman's grandfather's gauge had been the only thing precise enough to prove the paper wrong, what wrong number is still sitting quietly in some official book near you, waiting for someone patient enough to walk the ground and measure the truth of it themselves? Tell me in the comments which moment of Yunru's story you would have found hardest to survive, and subscribe if you want the next bride of Gamsan to arrive on your screen the moment her story is ready.